I want to welcome all of you to the School of Architecture's inaugural Sarah Schallenberger Brown Cultural Landscape Symposium, Race and Public Space, Commemorative Practices in the American South. I'm Beth Meyer. I'm a professor in landscape architecture and the director of the new Center for Cultural Landscapes, one of the organizers of the event. The others include the center's program manager, Carly Griffith, who many of you have met, who's done a lot of the background work for the symposium, and the indomitable Tanya Denkla-Cobb and Frank Dukes, the current and former directors of the UVA Center for Environmental Negotiation. This evening, our symposium launches with a keynote lecture, What Can and Can't Be Said, Race, Uplift, and Monument Building in the Contemporary South by Dell Upton, professor of architectural history at UCLA, and a former colleague of ours. Dell's book, as some of you may have noticed, is available for purchase outside. I promised the bookstore I'd mention that. And also a big thanks to the Virginia Festival of the Book for being one of our partners on this event. I also want to thank BNSF Railway, our corporate sponsors. Now, I'm going to introduce Dell more formally in a few minutes, but I want to say a few words first about two remarkable women, two brown women who are responsible for endowing the UVA Cultural Landscapes Initiative, including this symposium within the school. In 2010, Sally Brown's granddaughter, Carrie Brown, endowed the school's cultural landscape initiatives in her grandmother's honor. Sally's lifelong interest in the arts, as well as conservation and the curation of historic sites and natural places, was accompanied by extraordinary generosity to many institutions and organizations. The scope and the reach of her concerns and passions, which as you can see spanned 100 years, a few of which are noted on the screen, map squarely onto the aspirations of our cultural landscape initiatives that range from research, interpretation, preservation, planning, and design of sites that are full of both nature and history, memory and living systems, contested narratives, and disturbed ecosystems. Sally grew up in Arkansas, but came to Virginia to attend Sweetbriar, and her connections to UVA were initially through her husband, Lyons Brown, and since the 1950s, several of their children and grandchildren have also attended the university. So Carrie, one of the granddaughters, and her generosity exemplifies that of the extended family. Carrie, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, is an alum of the College of Arts and Sciences, a member of the UVA Arts Council, trustee of the UVA Arts Endowment, and served on the Fralin Art Museum board for a decade. Her connection to the cultural landscape work within the school comes through an undergraduate classmate of hers who's an innovative practitioner in this area, and we're indebted to that alum for introducing Carrie to the school. Now, cultural landscape coursework and research at UVA dates back to the 70s and continues with the creative and scholarly work of professors Bargman, Brown-Wilson, Crane, Galliazard, Johnston, Keller, Lee, McGinnis, Nelson, Sewell, Sherman, and others. Whether we've all used the term or not, for decades, our faculty have collaborated with our students to construct cultural landscape frameworks for reading sites and places through community history workshops, during field work and design studios in small towns, rural vernacular settlements, post-industrial landscapes, and fallow cities, as well as in more recent developments of new tools for exploring and understanding the entanglements of people with places. They include a Food Heritage Cultural Landscape Atlas, an innovative community mapping project to reinterpret Pollock's Branch, and a very exciting new university-wide landscape studies initiative that launches next semester. So Carrie's gift has set the stage for renewed energy and commitment on the part of the school to creatively and critically engage with place, not through nostalgia for an idealized past or with the detached objectivity of rational mapping, but through an awareness of the always contested nature of the cultures within a cultural landscape, the multiple publics who are involved in and who have the right to the city, to public space. So when Carly and I were planning the first of what would be an annual event here, we wanted to start identifying topics that would examine sites and issues that mattered in contemporary society and that brought community members to the university, where their experiences and expertise could flow towards us and not just from us to them. We wanted these lectures to extend Sally Brown's engagement with sites that are full of nature and history and that have meaning and value to the diverse publics that live and work within them, that draw pleasure and identity from them. So while we mulled over these ideas, one kept surfacing in the news and in our everyday lives. Who has the right to the city? And who exactly is the public in our public spaces? How can more inclusive understandings of our collective heritage emerge in communities such as ours and those that many of you represent, where the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow are evident in visible and invisible ways? In both monuments, as seen in this telling diagram by the Southern Poverty Law Center that juxtaposes the construction of Civil War memorials with key civil rights, legal decisions, and social events. But also in the lingering root shock of urban renewal, and I'm using Mindy Thompson-Fullilove's term, root shock here. Many of you are from communities where these issues are playing out in our city council chambers, through social media, and in physical alterations to historic public spaces. Locally, in Charlottesville, City Council appointed a Blue Ribbon Commission on Race, Memorials, and Public Space last May. And over a 6-month period, that group met with the public to understand local perspectives, sought advice on practices in other communities, and then offered a report with a range of suggestions for what to do with this commemorative statue in a 90-year-old park, Lee Park downtown. You will hear more about that statue and these recommendations, the status of this project and park tomorrow during our panel discussions and our site visit downtown. For now, I think it is fair to say that this local case study demonstrates that a city's future is difficult to disentangle from its history of race and public space, and that this history is alive in the memories of residents as well as in the material culture of the city itself, whether the 19th century slave market that abuts our city courthouse to the disappearance of a vibrant 20th century African-American neighborhood that was cleared in the name of modernization and progress. Now, a second local initiative has national networks and aspirations, transforming community spaces, bending the arc of memory towards healing and justice. A new project of the Institute of Environmental Negotiation is focusing on nationwide debates about commemoration, race, and public space. Tanya, Frank, and their advisory board are meeting together for the first time this weekend, and collectively they hope to develop, enact, and share guidance for communities and institutions to address our contested past and heritage through engagement, learning, creativity, and consensus building. And I hope that we all can draw on the extraordinary models of the two leaders at IEN to engage with these issues collectively over the next 2 days with great respect for each other's fundamental and important differences. Now, I can think of no better person to start this conversation with us than Dell Upton. Upton describes himself as a historian of architecture, material culture, and cities. And if you read his CV, and I'm not reading it to you, it is true. This is what he publishes about. He has advanced degrees in American civilization from Brown and has published extraordinary books on architecture, material culture, and cities. And you see the titles here. But 2 of his articles may be more suggestive of the tremendous impact he has had on the field of urban and architectural studies. And I offer these here for the students of all ages who are here in the audience. They both have had a big influence on me and many of us on the faculty. Architecture History or Landscape History, which was published in 1991, outlined a landscape approach to the study of architectural history that was social, cultural, and beyond the object. But in 1984, so think about that, Dell published White and Black Landscapes in 18th Century Virginia and examined the multiple experiences and meanings of colonial homes and plantations. Those experiences and meanings resulted from the different daily movements of master and slave, free and enslaved, across the very same buildings and landscapes. And I think there's some lessons there for us. So Dell Upton's more than a historian. Over the past 3 decades, he has changed our expectations of what architectural history can be and should be. He's a key figure in his generation of historians, I would say the key figure, who has opened up the study of buildings, landscapes, and cities by exploring more than the history of famous designers and their famous buildings. His writings reveal how the spatial organization, material assemblies, topographic hierarchies, networks of exchange, and the lived experience of place reify existing social and political relationships as well as enable new ones. Upton made his reputation writing about this in everyday urban landscapes of cities and rural settlements, and his most recent book explores this in post-civil rights commemorative sites that are marked by monuments and memorials to everyday citizens as well as canonical figures and cultural heroes. So Carly, Frank, Tanya, and I hope that Upton's account of these memorials and monuments will allow all of us gathered here to consider next practices, to create new ways of curating and narrating through design, new ways that transcend what Upton calls the problematic dual heritage framework for Civil War and civil rights commemoration, for the separate white and black experiences of being Southern. So it is with great respect and anticipation that I introduce Dell Upton and ask you to join me in welcoming him back to UVA. I think it actually worked. All right.
Well, thank you, Beth, both for that introduction and for the invitation to come back. It's wonderful to see so many old friends and some very old friends and some Paleolithic friends here tonight. What I want to talk about fits very nicely in, whoops, we're going faster than I intended to. Very nicely with the issues that Beth was raising. As you all know, our nation, the South, but not only the South, has experienced 2 civil wars, almost 100 years apart. The first being the Great Rebellion of 1861 to 65. The second being the Second Civil War being the equally well-known, heavily documented conflicts of the 1950s and 1960s. These 2 civil wars, 2 signal monuments in the struggle for black liberation and black citizenship that neither started nor ended with them. And each has its own war memorials. And interestingly timed in the same relative sequence, that is about 40 or 50 years after the end of the conflict. War memorials tend to be built as the older generation, the war generation ages. The World War II Memorial in Washington is an example. Civil War memorials, of the period between 1890 and 1920, another example. And the Civil Rights memorials that were built between about 1990 and continue to be built. And one of the interesting and paradoxical things about the study of civil rights memorials is that they are very much war memorials. They used the language of war memorials, the visual language of war memorials, the verbal language of war memorials, even though the civil rights movement, for the most part, was a nonviolent movement, and it was one in which the violence was, for the most part, entirely on one side. So one of the issues about these memorials that have been built in the past 30 years is that there's this peculiar conjunction between the visual language, the memorial language, and the events that they're meant to commemorate. But the result of these generations of war memorials or successive war memorials is an odd public memorial landscape, particularly in the South, where you have state houses and courthouses that are host to large numbers of monuments to the Confederacy and other manifestations of white supremacy. The Confederacy and its Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction aftermath. But you also have a growing number of monuments to the civil rights movement and to the black freedom struggle more generally. And this has always been an unsettling juxtaposition. How can the same public space honor the two really opposite kinds of causes? And it's become even more problematic with the resurgence of openly expressed white supremacy since the election of Barack Obama, since the massacre in Charleston 2 years ago, and encouraged during the campaign and the incumbency of the current president. So that these issues have come up and have become more urgent and more widely discussed in the public realm, the example of Charlottesville being one of many in the South. So what I want to do today is to present a series of vignettes, and I emphasize that they're vignettes, they're not complete stories, about 4 Southern monuments, 2 old and 2 new, that especially highlight some of the factors that make the juxtaposition of these 2 kinds of monuments in public space problematic. And that are part of the debate over statues and other Confederate symbols that stretch most recently from Columbia to Charlottesville. The first of these monuments is what's called the Liberty Place Monument, or the Liberty Monument, or the White Supremacy Monument, or the White League Monument. It commemorates an event that took place in New Orleans on September 14th, 1874. When members of a group called the Crescent City White League, they were the military arm of the local Democratic Party, fired on a mixed-race group of metropolitan police and state militia that were ironically led by the former Confederate General James Longstreet. This so-called Battle of Liberty Place lasted about 10 minutes. But very briefly, it overthrew the legally elected government of the city and state and installed members of the White League in its place. This monument was erected on the site of this confrontation in 1891. Here's a photograph of it on its original site in the middle of Canal Street in New Orleans. As Lawrence, it was erected to commemorate these events of 1874. Lawrence Powell, the historian of New Orleans, has pointed out that this for New Orleans is a kind of surrogate Confederate monument because New Orleans was in fact recaptured very close to the beginning of the war, so it didn't have any glorious Confederate history to celebrate. So this post-Confederate confrontation stands for it. This site, this monument, became a place of celebrations. Every year they would celebrate the anniversary of the confrontation. It became a place for celebrations of Confederate events and heroes. It became a place for various kinds of white supremacist celebrations. For example, in 1948, Dixiecrat candidates for office gave speeches at this monument. It's kind of a Flying Dutchman of monuments. It's been moved at least 3 times that I know. And part of that, and that's part of the story. In 1932, this monument, by now, 40 years old and deeply embedded in the white culture of New Orleans, was handed over by the city to the control of something called the Liberty Place Commission. Their members were required to be, by city ordinance, descendants of men who fought for white supremacy. And at the same time, several inscriptions were added to the monument. One said, McInerney and Penn, having been duly elected governor and lieutenant governor by the white people, were duly installed by the overthrow of carpetbag government, ousting the usurpers, Governor Kellogg White, Lieutenant Governor Antoine Colored. Another inscription said, United States troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers, but the national election of November 1876, the one which resulted in the end of Reconstruction, recognized white supremacy and gave us back our state. So this monument, by the time it had been here about 80 years, in the 1970s, African Americans began to agitate for its removal. Or I should say, more accurately, in the 1970s, the white newspapers began to recognize that African Americans were not happy with the monument. African Americans generally, and many whites in New Orleans, wanted the monument to be removed. Many more whites, including members of the city's elite, whose ancestors had been part of the White League, didn't want it removed. So there was a series over 30 years of recurring debates over this monument. And it's a very long, convoluted story. Part of it is embedded in the peculiarities of local politics in New Orleans. But the main points of contention keep coming up over and over. The first one was whether the White League was a white supremacist organization. The White League was a white supremacist organization. The name makes that very clear. Its original charter stated its unrelenting opposition to what it called the stupid Africanization of politics in Louisiana, and the resentment of whites of their, meaning black people's, increasing arrogance, which seems to know no bounds, their increasing dishonesty, which they regard as statesmanly virtue, their contemptuous scorn of all the rights of the white race. The White League was also a terrorist organization. It murdered several Republican white and black officials throughout Louisiana, as well as staging this battle in the streets of New Orleans. But the main standard, locally revered, still in print history of the White League in New Orleans, written by Stuart Landry in 1954, printed the White League's manifestos, leaving out all those passages about white supremacy. So the first response to the monument, which happened in 1974, was to place a plaque on the monument that said that this was a historical artifact that no longer represented the views of the citizens of New Orleans. The second issue that came up was whether the monument itself promoted white supremacy. Despite the evidence of the nature of the White League, the argument that was made was that it was not a white supremacist monument until those inscriptions were added in 1932, that otherwise it was a monument to so-called good government and home rule. One supporter of the monument said, white leaguers were revolting against a corrupt government under which taxes went up 1,000%. And the monument, he said, allowed us to recognize and remember a cherished part of the South's history. Of course, the obvious question is, cherished by whom? So the second step, which happens in 1981, is to remove all the non-original inscriptions from the monument, including the 1976 apologetic inscription. You can see the plaques that were stuck in where the 1932 inscriptions were chiseled out. In the late 1980s, the monument was removed for street improvements, and a battle ensued over whether to return it to public view. White city council members passed an ordinance of a kind that's very, very common in the South in both city and state governments that prevented the removal of any monument. As African Americans gain more political power in the South, whites are determined to protect their particular symbols. But they added a clause that said you can't remove any monument unless it promotes hatred of any group or promotes violence against authority. So the argument about the White League revived, was it really a white supremacist organization? But a more important one was raised, and this is one that is significant for all of these battles over monuments, and that is whether the removal of the monument constituted censorship. And there were two prongs to that again, come up over and over in monument battles. One is that, did this monument represent true history? That is the sense that history is something that's fixed, that is factual, and it's either true or it's not. Betty Wisdom, who was one of the descendants of the White League organizers and the wife of a very prominent judge, said that monuments were only legitimate if they were true. The Liberty Place monument, she said, was not true, and therefore it should be removed. So as I say, monuments are assumed by all parties not to represent a point of view, but to depict some particular objective historical truth. The second issue that, again, comes up over and over, is the monument itself history? Those who supported the retention of the monument say that to remove the monument is to censor history. David Duke, whom you all know, said at a public hearing that vandalism and the removal of the monument were Nazi-like acts of rewriting public history. And it's worth noting that the rabbi who was conducting the hearing did a kind of spit take, and he asked Duke if he was really condemning Nazis. And Duke said, "I freely condemn Nazism. Nazis are the ones that try to change history. The monument is part of our history and should be preserved." And Duke continues to hold white supremacist events at the monument down to today. But even a respectable historian like Robin Winks of Yale said that the monument was certainly offensive, but to destroy it would be a 1984-like act of censorship. So he suggested putting it in a museum, except that the Louisiana State Museum refused to accept it. So another claim that comes up over and over is the claim that existing monuments themselves are history, as opposed to being commemorations of particular aspects of history from a particular point of view. If monuments are in fact history, then it is indeed to rewrite history to remove them. But if they are commemorations of history, then the past consists of an infinite number of events, and we only choose to celebrate or to mourn a few of those. So the choice of what should be commemorated in a monument is one that is constantly open. A third important issue is the issue of the placement of monuments in public space. The American notion of public space, which really forms in the very early years of the Republic, is that public space is a neutral ground. It's there for everyone, not to be used for any particular person's benefit. But what that means is that if we put anything in public ground, it implies that is there is consensus support. We all believe this. We all support this if we put it on public ground. Even though nearly every monument is a product of some particular point of view, nearly every monument is a product of its honorees or their partisans. Nevertheless, the fiction is that to put a monument in public space is to say, we, all the people, support this particular view. So that's the fiction of public space, that public space, objects in public space represent consensus. So one of the things that arises is that most of the people, even the people who are most violently opposed to the display of the white supremacy monument, had no problem with putting it in a museum or putting it on private property, displaying it on private property. But it was the implied continuing active endorsement of the White League's actions that by the presence of the monument in public space, that was an issue. So the City Human Rights Commission, which got involved in this issue in the later stages, said the citizens of the 1890s, meaning the people who built the monument, the citizens of the 1930s, meaning those who added the white supremacist inscriptions, were free to pick and choose their own heroes and select the manner in which they were to be memorialized. The citizens of the 1990s should be free to exercise their own judgment in the same manner. Their rights are not fewer for having come later. So the argument of opponents was, in the new majority black post-segregation city, this monument did not deserve the endorsement that it received from its placement on public property. And again, another theme that comes up over and over in these discussions is these white supremacist monuments were able to be placed in the late 19th, early 20th century by a small white minority of the population who could put them up without question. And then when people come along, particularly African Americans who come along and want to put up their own monuments, these become micromanaged by the sense that they have to somehow please everybody. Obviously, Civil War monuments and the Liberty Place monument were not intended to please everybody. So in New Orleans, ironically, a coalition of white supremacists and historic preservationists went to court. Using historic preservation laws, they were able to force the city to re-erect the monument reasonably close to its original site. And the city very cleverly chose, in fact, to re-erect it near the original site, but in a space behind a parking lot and a parking garage next to a railroad track behind the aquarium. It really takes some looking to find this monument. So what happens in this case is, despite the presence of this law that says that monuments that support hatred of any group and support violence against authority can be removed, despite the fact that the opponents of the monument have on their side very clear historical documentation that shows that this monument did both. This monument to white supremacy, to violence against authority, was preserved. The State Historic Preservation Officer entered the fray on the side of the pro-monument group and argued that he could see nothing about it that promoted either violence or white supremacy. And so the point is that the white point of view, the white supremacist point of view, prevailed. The monument was judged not to violate the ordinance, and it remains. And this is true, again, in these controversies over and over, in battles over the southern monumental landscape, whether the monuments commemorate the Confederacy, whether they commemorate African American history, whites always claim the right to have the last word. They always claim to be the ultimate arbiters of what's fair, accurate, acceptable, offensive, or inoffensive. So the final act was not to remove the monument or to put up a plaque disavowing its message, as had been done in the 1970s, but to attach a plaque to the base that added the names of the police and militia killed by the White League. And it says, as you can see, in honor of those Americans on both sides of the conflict who died in the Battle of Liberty Place, a conflict of the past that should teach us lessons of the future. What lessons should it teach us? This clearly implies that both sides were somehow legitimate. So this is a second victory for the white side. The white supremacists not only got to keep their monument, but they got an inscription on it that gave them equal status with the people who were defending the legally established government. So that brings us to our second case study that asked about this kind of evasiveness, to what I call dual heritage. Here's the Confederate Memorial in Montgomery, very elaborate construction. It stands next to the State House. Someone once called it a very nice second-place trophy. It sums up the lost cause ideology of the late 19th century. There's nothing about it that's unusual, but it's just very, very visually and verbally, explicitly laid out. The female figure on the top holding the flag, the figure of patriotism, holds the furled flag, which refers to a poem called The Furled Flag, written by a man named Abram Ryan, right at the end of the Civil War, a man usually called the Confederate Poet Laureate. Around the base are these statues representing the branches of the Confederate military. There are poetic inscriptions that liken the Confederate military to chivalrous knights of the Middle Ages. The speakers at the dedication claimed that even though the New South had rejoined the Union, was glad to rejoin the Union, it did not apologize, had nothing to apologize for about the Old South. It did not admit the Old South was wrong. So this went on and on here, but the monument also encapsulates the ideology of the New South that's being formulated at that time, that sees the Civil War as a matter of differences of principle among honorable white men who had, and something that had nothing to do with African Americans or slavery. The current corollary of this is the absurd claim that thousands of African Americans fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. Therefore, the Civil War was not about race. In this context, something very interesting happened. On the night of November 10th or 11th in 2007, people woke up on the 11th and found that someone had redecorated the monument, spray painting the hands and faces of the figures black, and spray painted the inscription NT 111131 on the base. This was a reference to Nat Turner and to the day he was executed. What's interesting about this is the way this was parsed in the days immediately following the incident. The first response was to suggest this was mindless, youthful vandalism. Then people began to say this was an insult not only to Civil War soldiers, but to all soldiers, a sacred class who shouldn't be insulted. Then, very quickly, it began to be described as a hate crime against all whites. What the paint job did was expose this fiction of the black Confederates, because if so many black people fought for the Confederacy, why should it matter whether statues on a memorial are represented as black people or white people? But in fact, what it revealed is the underlying assumption that the Confederacy is the heritage of white people, and that it is a separate, equally honorable heritage to African Americans, whose heritage was the Civil Rights Movement. So the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement seen as parallel, equally valid heritages. One newspaper writer said, had the Martin Luther King statue been so defamed, all possible law enforcement agencies would descend on Montgomery to join in the massive hunt. However, since it is only a mere memorial to our beloved and honored Confederate ancestors, not much attention is being given to this heinous act, which in fact was not true. But aside from the fact that this person apparently forgot that there was no Martin Luther King statue in Montgomery, this is as clear a statement as you can get of the idea of dual heritages. The same thing emerged in negative form in the debate over the Liberty Place monument. One defender of the monument said that if the monument was removed because it offended African Americans, the Martin Luther King monument in New Orleans, which they really do have, should be removed because it was equally offensive to whites. So what's happened since the Civil Rights Movement of the 50s and 60s, exemplified both in New Orleans and in Montgomery, is that most, not all, but most whites have shifted from defending the message of the monuments and the justice of the Confederacy as history, as truth, and turned it into heritage. Unlike history, which is argued from evidence, heritage is the property of a particular group of people, definable only by them and not open to legitimate questioning by anyone outside the group. Since whites, by the 60s and 70s, unable any longer to completely deny African American claims to a place in the historic record, they postulate, and African Americans for the most part have gone along with this, postulate that blacks and whites in the South had separate, parallel, equally valid, equally honorable heritages. So both black history as heritage and white history as heritage, in this view, have their own inner logics, have their own trajectories, and they did not and must not be allowed to cross. As this plays out in the monumental landscape, what this means is that each heritage is presented as isolated from the other in ways that don't inflect or contradict the other. These are two monuments on the Capitol grounds of Tennessee. In the background is Sam Davis, the boy hero of the Confederacy, who was kind of seen as a Confederate Nathan Hale. In the foreground is a monument to the Middle Passage. To put up a monument to the Middle Passage is a very subtle move, because the Middle Passage, for most people who were enslaved in Tennessee, would have been generations in the past. Tennesseans wouldn't have been involved in it, so that Tennessee could acknowledge the horrors of the Middle Passage and yet not raise any questions about Sam Davis and the cause that he was promoting. And this is easy for whites, because in white views of history, African Americans play a relatively small role. But it's harder for African Americans, who have to take some account of slavery and racism without making whites the driving force of their story. But in every case, again, the story of heritage has to meet white approval. One of the firmest rules of monument building in the contemporary South is never offend white people or make them feel bad about themselves or their ancestors. And as I say, the Middle Passage monument tells a story that doesn't actually involve any white Tennesseans. And so it doesn't raise any uncomfortable questions about the boy hero of the Confederacy. So our third story. Let me show you what I mean by another vignette. In 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, as the culmination of a statewide white supremacist campaign to drive African Americans and Republicans out of public office, a campaign led by the Raleigh News and Observer. This culminated in November of 1898, in what is historically known as the Wilmington Race Riot, although historians these days see it as more accurately as the Wilmington coup and massacre. Whites in the city, organized by members of the city's elite, published what they call the White Declaration of Independence. They gathered together, burned the office of the black newspaper, drove out elected black and white office holders, and murdered an undetermined number of people. So this is another version of what happened in New Orleans with the Battle of Liberty Place. In the 1990s, a civic-minded group of black and white Wilmingtonians decided that the city needed to come to grips with these events, particularly since many African Americans felt that these events still affected their own economic and political fortunes in the city. So they raised all the usual motives that are raised in these kinds of projects of healing, of commemorating how much progress has been made in the South since that time. To show that, they tried to involve the grandsons of the two principal leaders of the white coup organizers, both of whom were still among the most economically and politically powerful men in Wilmington. One of these men refused to participate, the other agreed to participate. But they both said the same thing about it. Both said that their ancestors had nothing to apologize for. That, as in New Orleans with the Battle of Liberty Place, this was a good government move. Hugh McRae IV, who was the man who agreed to participate, said, "The problem is not blacks and whites, but disenfranchised versus enfranchised. I use those words to mean those people who don't have a stake in society, who don't have a good job, and don't have an education, who don't have opportunity versus those who do." So his argument is that the problem with having African Americans running the city of Wilmington in political office is that they had no stake in society and no qualifications to be part of the government. this is factually untrue, and you can see that it's factually untrue if you walk around Wilmington today. That since well before the Civil War, Wilmington had a very prosperous black professional and artisanal middle class. Their physical remains give you a sense of that. So the 1898 actions were really designed to destroy the livelihoods of many of these people. It was not about turning out a corrupt and unqualified group of people, but it was about ending middle-class black participation in the economy and politics. And this is relevant to understanding the monument that was built there, which in fact was so contentious that it didn't get built till 10 years after the celebration. The organizers of the monument assured everyone that no one would be made to feel bad about his or her ancestors, that no one alive today was to blame, et cetera, et cetera. So the original design of the monument was to create a monument that had all over it vignettes showing African Americans in late 19th century Wilmington plying their trades, engaged in their professions, engaged in their social and religious activities. And that was the issue in the events, the desire of African Americans to participate in modern Southern society as full members. But the final monument is this. It eliminated these vignettes, these aspects. It supposedly represents a series of paddles that express the role of water in a generalized, essentialized African culture, the role of ancestors and so on. So what it did was turn these aspiring middle-class, black, modern people of Wilmington into just the kind of essentialized African natives that the white Wilmingtonians imagined them to have been. Takes them out of their context as people living in 19th century Wilmington, North Carolina, and puts them back into some sort of vaguely unspecific Africa. So here's a monument that commemorates black people who died or were driven away for aspiring to participate in civil society, but avoids that issue, thus making no one uncomfortable. So if it's just about these kind of generalized Africans, then and we're commemorating these generalized African deaths, then we don't really have to ask about the people who did it or why they did it. So that's, from a design point of view, one of the strange things about the site planning here is there's no way to take a photograph of this monument without the traffic signals in the background. Partly because it was put on land given by the highway department as they were building this bypass around Wilmington. So how does one deal with a black story then in a Southern monument? This, to me, is the best or one of the best African American history monuments in the South, and I emphasize that because much of what I'm going to say about it is critical. But on the whole, it's highly successful, despite the fact that, like many contemporary monuments, it tries to do too much. It tries to do everything in one fell swoop. And despite the fact that it has the very heavy hand on it of dual heritages and of the don't offend white people rule. In fact, we could see it as the most prominent example of this dual heritage ideology in the South. It grew very directly out of the controversy over flying the Confederate battle flag over the South Carolina state capitol, which was raised in 1961 during the Civil Rights Movement and not taken down. There was a great battle. Several times there was an effort in fact, there have been efforts to take it down since the 1970s. It hadn't worked. But a very adroit politician named Glenn McConnell, whom you see here on the right in his Confederate reenactor costume, who is then a state senator. He's a Confederate reenactor. He owns a shop in Charleston that sells Confederate memorabilia. He was a supporter of flying the Confederate flag on the state capitol, but he was a supporter of that from a dual heritage perspective. So he was happy also to have some sort of African American monument. And I should say that my research on that is indebted to him. When I was working on this monument, he had become this lieutenant governor because the previous lieutenant governor had an embarrassing corruption case. So McConnell's office, it took a long time to track down the records for this monument. It turned out that McConnell had them. So he said I could see them and I should come to the state capitol, and they dumped them on the floor in the middle of the rotunda, and I had to sit there and look through them with tourists going around. But at any rate, he was actually very, very adroit in steering the course of creating this monument. He saw the African American freedom struggle as one of three equivalent freedom struggles. He said, first there was the struggle for liberty from the British, then there was the struggle for state rights, and finally the struggle for civil rights, seeing no conflicts among any of these things. So he later chaired the commission that brought the African American History Monument to fruition. Think of that, a Confederate reenactor chairing the African American History Monument Commission. So the question comes up, once the state has decided, as part of a compromise that will move the flag from the Capitol to the Confederate monument on the State House grounds. They would also build an African American History Monument, but what should it depict? The co-chair of this commission was an African American state senator named Darrell Jackson, and he said he wanted a generic monument that would, in his words, accentuate the positive aspects of the black story in South Carolina and serve as an inspiration for visiting children. We don't need to deal in horror, we need to deal in honor. What the monument should do is talk about black endurance in the face of oppression, not about who was doing the oppressing. So the commission held a number of hearings in all the congressional districts around the state, asking about citizens' views of what the monument should include. Many people, both black and white people, wanted a monument that was infused with the idea of dual heritages. Other people wanted to represent more confrontational South Carolina heroes, such as Denmark Vesey, the organizer, or possibly not, of a slave uprising in 1821, or Robert Smalls, who was a man who commandeered a Confederate ship and fled to his own freedom that way, and later came back and was a pioneering African-American member of Congress. Some wanted the Orangeburg massacre, in which state police killed a number of African-American students at Orangeburg State in the 1960s. But it was determined very explicitly that the monument should have nothing on it that would offend anyone. And this went into its form. There was a competition. A man named Ed Dwight won the competition. Dwight is a person who has a near monopoly on, if he were a corporation, the courts would break him up for antitrust. If you see any monument in the United States that has anything to do with an African American subject, from culture to politics to history, if you guess Ed Dwight, you have a 50% chance of being right. So Dwight got the commission, and you've heard the old adage about things designed by committee. In this case, the design by committee made the monument better than it would have been if Dwight had done it on his own, because his first proposals were defined by cliches of African American history, very few of them having to do with anything that happened in South Carolina. He wanted a central tower of progress, as he called it, flanked by panels representing both South Carolina and national black history. He wrote, "I go from 1619 and stop with the marches in Washington." The floor of the monument would include 3 granite engraved middle crossing icons. The monolith, the Tower of Progress, would be covered with images of heroes and sheroes, including Denmark Vesey, but also people like Crispus Attucks, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, none of whom had anything particular to do with South Carolina. So to cut to the chase, this is the monument that resulted in the tug of war between the committee and Ed Dwight. On the one hand, it is filled with essentialized Africanisms of the sort we saw at Wilmington. There are the Tower of Progress that you see in the back has become an obelisk, which is a popular Afrocentric symbol. The curving form of the walls, according to Dwight, represented the round form of an African village, which again, a kind of essentialized notion of Africa, even though in fact the reason that it takes that form is it was required to fit the space of a circular flower bed that had been there first. Rocks from Africa were attached to it. So we have this essentialism, but we have it in tension with a narrative history that is found on those curving walls of the monument. And it's very interesting how this very powerful story is told in these panels, even though they're inflected by dual heritages and the don't embarrass white people principle. For example, just as in Nashville, the Middle Passage, slavery's brutality is restricted to the Middle Passage. So you don't see the brutality of slavery in any of the vignettes that actually involve South Carolinians. In fact, other than this panel and the panel, the first panel, which represents a slave sale, there are no white figures at all. And this accords very nicely with the white Southern myth, that slavery was foisted on the South by outsiders. So here are these evil slavers bringing Africans to South Carolina. It was determined, partly because of the insistence of Dwight and other citizens of having Denmark Vesey, it was determined that no recognizable person be included in the monument. So we have this panel called Resistance, which we see a secretive enclave, and where it comes chronologically in the narrative, you would expect it would have something to do with Denmark Vesey's plot, but it's actually represented as people planning to escape slavery, not to overthrow it. One of the climactic panels in the center about the Civil War, which is given the lost cause title of the war between the states, shows no conflict again. Black soldiers fighting no one, but just men marching. Most strikingly, when we get to the Jim Crow era, the panel on the Jim Crow era has no images at all. Dwight had wanted to use images of lynchings, of the Ku Klux Klan, but these were determined to be too inflammatory, and so only words are used in this panel. And then you get to a final double panel that shows 20th century black achievements. And here we get an inadvertent acknowledgement of the don't offend white people rule, because remember, you're not supposed to have any recognizable people on here as a way of avoiding Denmark Vesey. But it's very easy to recognize Dizzy Gillespie, Ronald McNair the astronaut, Jesse Jackson, Joe Louis, and on and on and on. But when reporters asked about this years after the monument had gone up, don't you have these images of people we all know, and yet you're not supposed to have images? The commission said that such readings were purely interpretive. Last month, I talked to a woman who was on the Monument Committee, and she told me that they were in fact real people, but they were meant to stand for generic black achievements in those particular fields. But this sense that it's the dual heritage, another way that this is evidenced, in 2015, there was a change.org petition that said, since the Confederate flag had been taken down from the Confederate monument after the Charleston massacre, and as I understand, recently put back up, since that part of the bargain was broken, the African American monument should be removed. So, what's the matter, you might ask, with the issue of dual heritages? Why shouldn't African Americans and whites both have monuments to their heroes. And I think there are a couple of answers to that. The first is the implied public approbation that placement on public land accords to monuments. So here we have the Stonewall Jackson with these Aryan youth on the base and their Confederate shield. Some of you know from Daniel Bluestone's research that this was a site created by clearing out a group of black occupied buildings in order to put this monument up. So how can the city, how can the state, how can a public body, how should they celebrate both white supremacy and the resistance to white supremacy? The second, and I borrow a little bit from those who think that monuments should be true, they can't be true in any ultimate sense, but they can be honest. Southern history was not a dual history, or not even a more than dual history, since Asians and Native Americans and others were here as well, but it's a single history. Here's a monument, it happens to be in Springfield, Illinois, that tries to confront that. It's a memorial to a race riot. It shows the soldiers. It shows people burning down African-American part of the city and assaulting people and so on and so on. The shapes of the monument are supposed to be burned out buildings. Even this is a little pusillanimous. Acts of intolerance should be presumably acts of murder and arson and so on. But that would be a little hard. So when I say that Southern history should acknowledge this intersection, I don't mean that in a sort of happy face way, but in a sense that it's a difficult history that arose out of encounter, engagement, conflict among all kinds of parties. There are several recent monuments that I think do this, but I'll leave you with one monument that does it inadvertently, and because inadvertently, probably most effectively. And again, this is back at the South Carolina State House grounds. When I say the name Strom Thurmond, this is probably not the first one that springs to mind when you think about civil rights and African American history. But in fact, there is a monument to Strom Thurmond on the State House grounds. It was planned and erected at about the same time as the African American History Monument. Many of the same people were on the two monuments commission, both African American and white people. So again, we have that idea of dual heritages. It's not a particularly distinguished monument visually, and in many aspects, it's like the majority of public monuments that are erected today. One is that it wasn't paid for by the public. It was paid for by the corporations who owned him, and those are listed on the side. Public bodies today are very cowardly about monuments. They're willing to try to, they're willing to accede to celebrating certain groups or people or events, but not to the extent that they're willing to pay for it. So you can only have it if you can get somebody else to pay for it. So listed are these corporations, listed are his public offices, listed are the names of his 4 children. But as some of you know, shortly after Thurmond died, it was revealed that he had 5 children, that his oldest child was a daughter that he conceived with an African-American maid who worked for his family. And so at the insistence of the Thurmond children, her name was added to the monument. What's most striking about this, though, even more than the addition of Essie Mae Washington Williams Monument, is that how crudely it was done. There's no attempt made to hide it. If you look at the word 5, you can see 4 filled in underneath it. That her name is inscribed more crudely. It's not as emphatic as the names of the other children. This is not intentional. I assume that it's because rather than being carved in a monument, lettered in the monument yard like the rest of the monument was, it was lettered on site. It's very expensive to put monuments in and out, so rather than take it a place where they could do the job properly, they just did it on the sidewalk. So there's her name, and it stands out, and the emendation of the 4 and 5 stands out. So when we think about this statue of Thurmond, when we think about his disgraceful political history, political career, and we think about this very raw acknowledgement of his personal history, it all adds up, whether intended or not, to grappling with the complexity of Southern history. This monument doesn't have an easy interpretation. It doesn't have a comforting lesson or an obvious meaning or an uplifting moral, but it acknowledges the issue, however begrudgingly, and that's why I like it, and that's why I think it points to some kind of resolution to some of these issues. Thank you. Sure.
Questions from the audience?
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on Monument Avenue in Richmond?
What are my thoughts on it? Yeah, the question was, what are my thoughts on Monument Avenue in Richmond? And then the second part of your question was,
What, if anything, should be done to Monument Avenue?
what, if anything, should be done to Monument Avenue? Depends on what people in Richmond want. Monument Avenue is, everything's gone dark. Monument Avenue is a part of the same period, the same motives as all the other early monuments we've been looking at. It's also part of a real estate scheme. As you may know, the monuments were up before the houses were built. But if people want to get rid of it, there's a wonderful story from the Richmond Planet, which was the African American newspaper in Richmond. It came out at the time the monument was being put up, and one of the African American workers who was putting up the monument said to the reporter for this African American newspaper, "We put it up, and when the time comes, we'll take it down." Maybe the time has come. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Dell. Thank you so much for, I think, a really compelling lecture, and I can't wait to read the book just to kind of see and read more in depth about, sort of what you've discovered. And I also appreciated that you showed me that respectability politics are still alive and well,
Very much.
particularly with the, the Columbus monument.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just extraordinary that exists. But I wanted to hear maybe more on your thoughts about the kind of question of civil rights memorials and the way in which they mirror war memorials.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe thinking about it just made me think about the kind of violence that racial subjection is constantly enacting.
Mm-hmm. The civil rights memorials are a very peculiar issue because, as I mentioned, this is ostensibly a nonviolent movement, and the violence was entirely one-sided in the civil rights movement as opposed to a war memorial. And yet, the question comes up, and within the monumental language available in Western culture, how do you represent signal events? You represent great people, or you represent wars, great conflicts. And in war memorials, violence is always represented in a way that shows the good guys triumphing over the bad guys. But in most of these events, it's the bad guys triumphing over the good guys in the violence. But the problem is, how do you come up with a new language? And the second problem is the existence of all these other earlier Confederate memorials, which you're putting monuments in the context of. And also, they speak a language that people understand. So it seems to me that in many cases, the civil rights memorials revert to a language, a familiar, if not entirely appropriate language, both to make them, to put them in conversation or conflict with the earlier monuments, and also to make them legible. So in my feeling, in my sense of in looking at these monuments, that hasn't been solved. And one of the things that's happened then is that in recent years, in the past 10 years, the African American monument at South Carolina is a good example. Those civil rights monuments specifically have reached a kind of dead end, a stalemate. Partly because the civil rights movement is so sacrosanct, that even Trent Lott and those kind of people claim that they accept it. So what happens is that monuments are moving increasingly into thinking about African American history more broadly as a way of keeping the kind of underlying issues of liberation and conflict and so on alive, rather than letting them be frozen in an image of Martin Luther King or something of that sort. So it's an open question. The civil rights memorials that I think are best are the group in Kelly Ingram Park in Birmingham, because they represent conflict very openly. And they do that because Birmingham is a very unusual situation in which the city, since the election of Richard Arrington in 1979, the city politics has been so heavily black dominated that you don't have to worry about what white people think. They all live outside the borders and they can't punish you. So that this is a set of monuments in which the violence against African Americans is most openly represented. And yet again, you have that paradox, because one of the monuments is a version of that image of the police dog attacking the boy. So it's very much like an action war memorial where you have people bayoneting people, except the good guys are being overcome there. And these demonstrators call themselves foot soldiers. But at the same one of the monuments shows these steel police dogs with big teeth lunging out from walls, and you have to walk between these teeth. And the leashes say Birmingham Police on them. You couldn't say that in a lot of other places. And that monument wasn't ready when all the others were. And the popular story is that the police were so upset they were able to put off the erection of this monument. And Arrington told me, the mayor told me, that in fact he held it up because he thought it wasn't explicit enough, because it only said Birmingham Police. So he paid for the monument of the child being attacked by the police dog to make it very clear who was doing the attacking. So that, all these, when you think about war metaphors, and since we live in a very militaristic society where war is somehow the highest expression of everything, it confuses the issue. The language of monuments is basically the language of leaders in great events, and here we have a movement which is, other than its sexism, very democratic, and people have yet to understand how to address the kind of democracy of that issue. I actually think one of the monuments that does that most successfully is the one on Capitol Square in Richmond, which shows, on the one side, it shows a group of people ranging from the school children from Farmville to lawyers like Oliver Hill, and then on the other side, you have a kind of equivalent group of people who are modern people who benefited from that. So it's just It's a the reason that I gave the book the title "What Can and Can't Be Said" is that in the first place that issue of not offending people, so there's a limit to what you can say, but there's also a limit to the visual language of what you can say that hasn't been transcended, I think. Sarah?
That actually is a perfect setup for my question, which is about form. Sort of thinking about the different modes we saw in the vignettes, right? So it's roughly half and half between abstraction. If you sort of count the obelisks, I guess Columbia has it all: abstraction and figuration. But I'm just sort of wondering to what extent the sort of dead end or stalemate that you're talking about, which seems to be surmounted in this last instance by text, right, is actually a story about the limitations of monumental form as we've tended to know them. And so I'm wondering, are there examples of sort of abstract, the oars didn't cut it, obviously.
Yeah.
Are there sort of
There
success
are
stories
relatively
that are-
few, in part because I often get asked this question by art historians, which sometimes it says, why are these not good art? And other times, well, why don't they do what the Germans do with Holocaust memorials and so on? It's partly because my point of monuments being controlled by the people who are honored, or that the people who build these monuments, and this is true not just of civil rights monuments, but of most monuments in the U.S. today, they want the message to be very explicit. In an abstract monument, they don't trust visual metaphor. So they want it very clear what's being said. James Young, in his book on Holocaust memorials, talks about people who had been in the camps critiquing the kind of barbed wire being shown in a monument. So they want explicitness. They want only one interpretation to be said. So relying on visual metaphors is something that monument builders of all across the political spectrum at the moment are very uncomfortable with. But here's an example. I brought this here. I mentioned that there are examples of monuments that were good. This one is in North Carolina, in Salisbury. There is an entire block in the center of Salisbury that was the town cemetery. Over the years, it became segregated. In the 1850s, a man left in his will money to build a wall between the white and black sections of the cemetery. The white section, as you can see, is very lovingly cared for. The black section, as is often the case, those of you who know the cemeteries in Richmond, let go to hell. All the markers disappeared. Parts of the cemetery were cut away to widen roads and so on. And eventually, people kind of forgot it was there. And then 15 years ago, a local group wanted to commemorate this somehow. They held a competition, and the winning design, which again, wildly overburdened, but the central element of it was just to take out these blocks in the middle of the wall and scatter them across the lawn as though they'd been kind of blown out. And again, the white supremacists relied on historic preservation laws. This was a historic wall. But visually, you get the point. I hesitate to show it because, unfortunately, the city has now pushed all the stones back against the wall so they can mow it more easily. So you don't get the point quite. And the other one, which I think, which is really my favorite of all, is this one. It's at the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's house. In excavating for a subdivision on the site of a farm that had been owned by Jackson's wife's family, they came across first a Native American cemetery that was 10,000 years old, and then they came across this cemetery of enslaved African Americans, and they dug them all up so they could develop what to do with it. So the Hermitage volunteered to take these burials And so they separated people into individual bundles, and they buried them under a trench. And then they had a competition for how to mark that. And the person who won it, this guy Aaron Lee Benson, came up with this scheme that over the line of burials is this low dry laid wall, and then it's surrounded by these unshaped stones that look like it kind of looks like an English Neolithic circle, and it implies a kind of permanence there. He originally wanted to have each of these 30 stones paired with a flowering tree. He's very fundamentalist Christian guy, and so he wanted the stones to represent the eternal things of life, and then the trees to represent the changes of life. The new director of the Hermitage said, no, it will block the view of the little church that's there, so he wasn't allowed to do it. But the thing that is, I think, is so moving about this is that there are two other groups of burials on this site. One is a group of Donaldson, Jackson's wife's family members, who were moved there as well, along with their markers. And their markers are idiosyncratic. They are laid out in straight rows. And then the second is there was on this site in the late 19th century, early 20th century, an old Confederate soldiers' home. So there's a series of concentric circles of these Confederate soldier graves, all individually marked, but all with identical small markers, and then a mound in the center with a general monument. So you have, when you look at this site, these are all maybe 50 yards from one another. You have on the one hand the circle of African American people who are wrapped individually but buried in a common grave. You have a circle of Confederate soldiers who are individually marked but alike, marked with identical gravestones. And then you have these rows of the Southern elite gravestones, all different. And so in looking at these three things together, you have a sense, and Benson said he wasn't thinking about this, but it's hard to avoid seeing again those kinds of intersections. People of various slots in Southern history who are, we can kind of see those relationships in these three different burial plots in ways that I think are very eloquent without having to have a text tell you to look at them like that.
As to your question of whether monuments are part of history itself or selective representations of history, can you offer any guidance on who gets to decide that and how?
Well, that's part of that. That's part of that battle over who is the fairest interpreter. In practice, who gets to decide it are white politicians and their constituents. But sometimes that doesn't work. Apparently hasn't worked in Charlottesville. It hasn't worked recently in New Orleans, which has voted to take down the Robert E. Lee statue at Lee Circle and a couple of other Confederate statues in town. But it's a political issue that has to be fought out, and has to be fought out constantly. I'm a great admirer of Chantal Mouffe's political theories. The notion of an agonistic society, that the point of political discussion is not consensus, but it is constant debate. And sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, but the question is never closed. And that's what laws, for example, that say you can't take down Confederate monuments are trying to say, is the question is closed. So my feeling is that this kind of back and forth will go on for some time, and that in some places people who want to get rid of the monuments will succeed, in other places they won't. And again, I would stress that most of the people who are against these monuments don't say melt them down. They say put them someplace that's not on public land. Do like the Russians, where they have these statue graveyards, or put them in let the SCV make their own park for them or something, that just where it's not being endorsed that this is part of the past that we as a community are proud of. Jennifer.
Other than the example you showed us where, thank you so much. Don't have to yell, thanks. Other than the example that you showed us of altering the wall and when the figures were painted black, are there more examples where people are actually in some way engaging the existing monument landscape by altering it or maybe creating a new monument from an old monument other than kind of stripping inscriptions off and some of the other examples? It seems very much like it's either we take it down and take it out of sight or we leave it here and are very firm.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it can be answered in a number of ways, because I know that a lot of people, including Lewis, think you should add some sort of inscription to the monument to recontextualize it. But I think the New Orleans example shows you exactly what the drawback of that is, because the conscription is still going to be compromised in some way. There are lots of examples of let's say, ad hoc monument criticism, like the one in Montgomery, and they've been going on for a long time. Some of you may know that in Charleston on Calhoun Street, which was the Black Main Street, named for Calhoun to be offensive, and a statue of Calhoun put there, which originally, now it stands on this very tall column. Originally, it stood on a fairly low pedestal. There's a memoir of a young middle-class African American woman who was young in the early 20th century, and she said every time we knew we were going to be passing that monument, we'd fill our pockets with stones, and we'd throw them at it and try to damage it. Right after I read that, I happened to be in the South Carolina Historical Society and picked up their newsletter with a little story about the Calhoun Monument. It said the original pedestal was replaced with this one after the first one proved unsatisfactory. But as far as, I guess one of the most conspicuous and failed examples of trying to recontextualize monuments, there's a Union Monument in Indianapolis, which has on it a number of figures, and one figure is an enslaved man in chains and so on, fairly naked. An artist named Fred Wilson proposed, he was hired to propose a piece of public sculpture, and he proposed making that figure, reproducing that figure at much larger scale and putting it in front of the jail. And this was opposed both by whites, but also by many African Americans who thought that it was somehow stigmatizing or stereotyping the people who were in jail, and it was never built. It got very close to being realized, and then a local radio host picked it up and turned it into a public controversy. But other than that, I don't know many attempts to try to recontextualize monuments in that way. Lewis.
Just to be fair,
Katja?
you know well, you know well, my position is not just reinscription, but in fact to hire a landscape architecture firm of some sort to do a whole-scale reinterpretation, reinstallation of the entire square.
What would that be?
What would that mean?
Yeah, what would that be like?
Something that situates these objects as a part of the 1920s Jim Crow South.
How would you
which
do
they're
that?
a product. I think that they could properly be interpreted as having completely removed the African American settlements that pre-existed that site. Mm-hmm. That they could be situated as objects in context with the lynchings that are happening all throughout this part of Virginia in exactly the same decades. That you could position them as part of the segregated school system, that's in place at exactly the same period, so that you sort of situate, use an artistic interpretation and installation, not just text, but a public monument, a public museum that positions these things as an object of the Jim Crow South that they were. That's my. I'd like us to be able to dream about that possibility of using art and history collaboratively to tell an accurately contextualized story.
Well, there are a couple of things that come to my mind about that. One is this issue I raised in passing about monuments trying to do too much. You know, you clutter them with all kinds of messages and so on. Monuments are, in the end, visual works, and they work visually. So, I mean, if you go to Colonial Williamsburg, you know, someone can tell you all day all the things that are wrong with what you see, but you'll come back with this visual impression that is Colonial Williamsburg to you. So I'm very skeptical that you could have such a didactic kind of installation that isn't trumped, pardon the word, by the fact that we respond to a white guy on a horse as being somebody important and great. I mean, I'm happy to see how that progresses, but the fact of the matter is that Lee still remains in a public space, put there by a guy who had the power to decide that Charlottesville needed these monuments.
It equally dissatisfied simply the removal of that monument to some other public square.
No, I wouldn't put it in another public square. I'd put it in, you know, in the SCV front yard or something like that.
In Charlottesville, when we had our discussion about the Jackson and Lee monuments, a lot of people in the community expressed a concern that removing the monuments would create what they called a slippery slope, and it would eventually imperil the artistic and architectural monuments to our other local founding fathers and slave owners, Jefferson and Madison and Monroe. And I was wondering if you think that the historical context for founding father era sort of heroes, for want of a better word, I put that in quotes, is the political situation different enough with them that the dynamics surrounding monuments and memorials to them is substantially different from what we see with Civil War era monuments?
Not necessarily. I think the slippery slope argument is a very common one. One of the people who wanted to save the Liberty Place monument said the next thing you know they'll be taking down Robert E. Lee, which is true, and then they'll change the name of the high school mascots from Rebels, and then they'll change the name of White Street to Black Street. But the counter argument to that is that, you know, these things go on a case by case basis. You know, I can't think of any case where in this country where monuments have been removed without discussing that individual person. But if the local great men are removed, you know, think of Ozymandias. It happens. We change our minds. We think about things differently. I think that it's fundamentally undemocratic in any case to set up people as demigods. That what's more interesting about somebody like Jefferson is not that he's a demigod, but that he's an ordinary person who did extraordinary things. So how do you want to deal with that?
I think that these questions have
Katya, you had a question.
Dave, tomorrow, is that the last one then, Katya?
Yeah.
All right,
Okay,
last
yes,
one, because this is going to go on for 7 hours tomorrow.
I'm sorry. but your talk and this discussion,
A little louder.
your talk and this discussion made me think about Vietnam War Memorial, and I think it is very powerful and it works because it does something that you advocate for. It invites a dialogue, encounter, engagement, interpretation. But it is a dialogue and encounter of a particular kind, something very intimate, impersonal kind. And I wonder if Southern history lends itself to this kind of encounter and a dialogue. In other words, is Vietnam War Memorial type possible for Southern history?
Well, it's actually for let's say for Civil War history. There's a wonderful passage in a Henry James novel, The Bostonian, where they visit Memorial Hall at Harvard, which is a building built in the 1870s that has a big hall that contains plaques to all the Harvard students who were killed in the Civil War, and the people in that scene, they're a northerner and a southerner, and they both react to these names in a very personal way. So what I would say about the Vietnam War Memorial, and I know everyone loves it, but I don't really. I wonder how much of the power that people apply to it now has to do with the fact that of their personal connection to these names. Because there are plenty of Civil War memorials in small towns that have the list of all the people from that town who were killed or sometimes just who fought in it. There's that Liberty Place monument with those names on it. I don't recall any accounts or anecdotes of people who now respond to that memorial on those memorials on the basis of the names that are there. So I wonder what people will think about the Vietnam War Memorial in 2 or 3 generations when there's more distance from the personal connection. And that's, it's obviously a question I can't answer.